little baby girl.
Hey guys, I'm Kate. Welcome back to my channel. Hi Bobby. Filming with dogs. So hard. And today we're going to go over the results of a writing would you rather sort of questionnaire that I did over on Instagram. This actually came to me because I was thinking about if I would rather be forced to write a love triangle in every single book or never be able to write any romantic arcs. And as someone who has like a romance pen name, this presented a very interesting conundrum. So I came up with a few more ideas. I sort of brainstormed it, then I asked people over on Instagram for some of their suggestions. Each of these questions got over 2,000 responses, so I'm really excited to share with you. Some of them were so neck and neck, separated by literally a handful of votes, and others had such a huge disparity. Some I was expecting, some I wasn't, so let's go ahead and dive in. I started this easy with just a basic setting question, but actually, like a lot of these, as you're considering actually having to write them, it becomes a little bit harder. So it's either would you rather write a historical setting or a futuristic setting. Now, obviously, you know, futuristic doesn't necessarily mean sci-fi. It can be like a near future, a slightly imagined, like a 2040 contemporary or something. And historical can have all of the makings of like a romance or, you know, an action adventure just set in this time period. But historical, you have to do more research. You still have to do research with futuristic, but I think you can get away with being like, this is how it is, and not necessarily explaining all of it unless you're doing one of those harder sci-fis. So for me, I like the idea of exploring a futuristic world, mostly because I don't want to have to do a whole bunch of research. But I can totally understand if you really liked the vibe of a certain era, that would be interesting, or if you're talking about more like societal issues at the time, that would be a necessary item. I guess I just enjoy, for some reason futuristic definitely feels more fantasy to me, even though I mentioned you can of course do a, you know, contemporary novel set just 20 years in the future. But I think I just lean towards that in almost everything that I do. So I waited the 24 hours so that I could get as many people to vote as possible. And I was so surprised. This split 46-54, you know, that's pretty close to even, but I guess I would have put my money on the futuristic. The next would you rather question was more process related, more the draft related, and it's would you rather write the opening chapter or the closing chapter? And this took a little bit more thought for me, mostly because the closing chapter seems to indicate that maybe, you know, I'm done with the book, and that's exciting to be done with the draft, but I get so many opening chapter ideas, and I actually find that tends to be the easiest part for me. So if I just had to sit down and write one day, which is how I decided to take the question, if I just had to sit down and write one day, I'd rather write an opening chapter. I think there's so much fun, there's a lot of potential in an opening chapter, and so that was my decision making. Yes. This split was a little bit more skewed to one side. 61% of y'all agreed with me that you'd rather write the opening chapter, but that's by no means a huge disparity. Then we got to would you rather write light and fluffy or dark and gritty? I love me some both of those, but if I have to live in a world, I decided on light and fluffy. And maybe that's more a how I was feeling that day thing, because I think if I was answering it literally right now, I would have chosen dark and gritty, but that's because the story I'm working on is a little bit dark and grittier. I have some moments of levity, because I think I can't write anything without that, but it's a little bit, could it be light and gritty? Is that a thing? But I was shocked by this answer, how many people chose dark and gritty. A whole two-thirds of people chose dark and gritty over light and fluffy, which I think is so interesting because I don't know, maybe I expected more of a 50-50 split, but that feels wrong. Now that but there's so many comedies. I'm trying to think of shows I watch too, and the books I choose to pick up. And I think my personal split is probably more 50-50, which is, I guess, probably why I chose light and fluffy. I need breaks from the dark and gritty. That's what it is. Like, I write every day, so if I'm gonna write every day, I'd rather have the light and fluffy, but there are moments of the dark and gritty that are wonderful. But 67%. Y'all want the grit. Then we had the suggestion, would you rather write an animal companion or found family? And actually I was on the Twitch stream that morning when I was talking about this, and Alvin made a really good point about how wouldn't an animal companion be kind of like a found family? And yes. But I do tend to think that when we're selling books, there's a selling point that is, this is a found family story, and oftentimes an animal companion is not part of that. So I think the question still holds. That being said, me and 70% of the rest of y'all chose found family over animal companion, but again on the Twitch stream. One of my favorite things is when the animal companion really has its own personality. That is just so much more fun. This is really present obviously in Disney movies and in like kids books, but I would love it to be more often. You know, obviously there's some fantasy where this is included, where you can read the mind or you can somehow communicate with the animals. And is that not the dream? Is that not something that growing up we're like, what if we could talk to animals? And I love that. I love it. Really what this is making me think is that I need to write more animal companions into my stories. Finally, we got to one of the genre questions. I actually only have 2 of these where I pit them up against each other genre to genre, so this was kind of hard to pick which one I wanted to do. But I decided for this question we would pick polar opposites. Horror and romance, and now I'm saying polar opposites in quotes because I think there's actually some similarities in when you want to plot horror and romance. But that is another topic for another day. Again, I have a romance pen name. Romance was the easy choice, though I do think it would be fun to eventually dabble in horror. 62% of people also chose romance, but that 38% of horror is pretty high. I know romance is one of those splits where people either really don't want it in their stories or they don't mind it or actively love it. Like there's the camps there have a pretty harsh division, and so I could totally see someone who may not be as into horror or may have never written horror choosing it just because they want nothing to do with romance. Or vice versa. Next up, we have, would you rather write a hard magic system or a soft magic system? And this is probably no surprise given how much I don't really want to research for historical, but I chose a soft magic system. I think there's a lot of rules required, obviously, in creating a hard magic system, and I think soft magic systems give you a little bit more flexibility, but also there's something like really cool in the rigidity of the hard magic system, so I was interested to see what people picked. Actually, I thought that there would be more than 62% of people who wanted the soft magic system. I have questions for you hard magic system people, namely how. I would like advice. I want to hear from you. Now we get to the tough question, which is, would you rather write only standalones or only series? And I think this one, Zelda, help me, why did I choose the way I did? I think for me this is another one where on any given day I might have chosen a different answer. I think in part I was struggling with the meridian maps when I said this. So I decided to do only standalones, but I think there's really something cool about series and getting to see the evolution of characters take a little bit longer, getting to spend more time with them. It feels more real just in the sense that we're getting to see, you know, multiple problems that they're encountering. Often teams, more characters, it's just, you know, but then I just love standalones. Unsurprisingly, this was split 53%, 47%, slightly in towards standalones. I'm going to bring up the romance pen name again, if only because I tend to think of some of them as series even when they only have a connection with the minor characters who takes off. And that's not really a series, it really is a standalone novel. It would just like pop up appearances, but there's something so fun in getting to include that character who's been there before. So maybe I should have said series, I don't know. Then we got to the question of process again, which is, would you rather write only one project at a time and you have to completely like draft, revise, and fully edit it before you can move on to something else? Or would you rather constantly be juggling 2+ projects, but get to do them in any sort of capacity, one's in draft, one's in revision, whatever, but you must always have 2. And this split was also more even than I thought. I don't know why, I guess because, you know, it's me and I have my one little brain. I thought more people would choose to juggle multiple projects. I think there's something really cool in being able to start a project, write it, edit it, finish it before you move on. I think there's a dedication required there. I've talked a lot about why my brain just likes to have at least 2 things that I'm working on and how it actually helps me come up with ideas for the other one, sort of a circular thing. But I can also see if you don't have a lot of time, it would be easier to just focus on one, or maybe your brain does not work the way mine does and does not like this. So a much more even split, 45-55. Finally, we get to the sort of one and only post writing question, a almost publishing question, but more in terms of like success, which is, would you rather write one award winner or one bestseller? And I think there's a little bit more thought that I had behind this than even I expected, because the idea of writing an award-winning novel is so cool. And also, I think a lot of the time when we're thinking about having an award-winning novel, we think it would likely sell pretty well, though that's not always the case. In fact, potentially not even often the case. Like, there is definitely some, you know, a Venn diagram overlap here, but it doesn't mean all of them live in this middle chunk, right? On the other hand, having one bestseller means that I was widely read, which I think ultimately my goal is to have, you know, I'm trying to write the best story possible. Whether that's an award winner or not is a completely different conversation, but having that many people read my book, that is why I chose the way I did. 64% also chose to write one bestseller, but I totally understand the one award winner as well. Really, that's what it is. Both of those would be so cool. For our final genre question, or second and final, would you rather write fantasy or sci-fi? So often these two genres are lumped together, especially in bookstores and libraries, but the connotations of those are very different. Like, if I just told someone off the bat what's like a fantasy thing, I think a lot of people would be like, dragons, magic. And then sci-fi feels often more futuristic, potentially space related. Like, they're very different, but obviously a lot of them require the same amount of coming up with stuff that doesn't exist or doesn't currently exist. In the terms of sci-fi, you might be kind of extending what you think will happen, but it's requiring a lot more back-end work potentially for the author than, say, a contemporary or something. And I get why there would be overlap in what the readers would enjoy. Having said that though, I chose fantasy and so did 82% of the other people. My reasoning is I actually don't read a whole lot of sci-fi. Though I find sci-fi interesting, I find it a lot more sort of constrictive. Is that the word, constricting? I think there are boundaries sort of placed on it that I'm not quite as into. In comparison with fantasy, I like to read more fantasy, watch more fantasy, write more fantasy. So just team fantasy, really. Our other suggested question was, would you rather write character description or setting description? Which I voted one way. Once again, I don't know why I pointed with my phone. Once again, I think that on any other given day, I would pick something else. I'm notoriously terrible at description and in fact have to put it in later. It's something that I work on, even just describing, like, if freaking my Scooby-Doo Meets Princess Bride story almost entirely takes place in one house or one sort of like ranch style home and grounds, and trying to describe this house so that people would understand the blocking, which is so important, was in part the death of me. I just wasn't quite there yet in terms of what I needed to be able to do. Character description is what I chose, and so did 58% of other people, but at the same time, I'm terrible at that too. In fact, Project Death was so that I would not have to name one, but also get better at character description, and I do think that has helped a lot. I think any other day I might have chosen setting description. Who knows? It's a tough question. Now, following my thought process from an earlier this or that question, I got, would you rather write the first draft or would you rather write the final draft? And this one was difficult, if only because first drafts are often easier for me, but on the would I rather be in a place, I would rather be in a place where I could be finishing the final draft, where I could be working on that. There's something really exciting about being on the final draft of something and the final push, and ultimately, you know, that's the closest step to getting the book out to others and to readers. So I did decide that I would rather write the final draft. It's kind of similar to the question about would you rather write the closing chapter versus the opening chapter, just extrapolate. Understandably, you have to write a lot more first drafts than you do final drafts. I don't know anyone, I don't know anyone who has finished every single draft they've started. Someone might be publishing their first book, they've finished the first final draft they've gotten to, but rarely is that their first draft, is that their first story they've started, stopped for whatever reason. So I chose final draft, and shockingly split even. 50% of people would rather write the first draft, and I get that though. It is what I have more experience with. I think it's more fun in some ways because I'm exploring the story as someone who does zero drafting. my first draft is, you know, I'm just finding out about the characters and the world, and that in itself is really interesting. So again, any other day, I think I would be on the other side of the 50. And at the time when I placed my vote, there were only 11 of us. Difference, 1,029 votes for first draft, 1,040 votes for final draft. That's so close. Arguably, this is also a genre question. I forgot about that. Would you rather write literary fiction or would you rather write genre or commercial fiction? And actually the results kind of shocked me, so I don't know if maybe if maybe the results are right, one, or my understanding of what literary means is different than others. But the split, 46% said they'd rather write literary fiction versus 54% that said they'd rather write genre or commercial. And I guess I'm just surprised because when I'm often talking with people, it's very often that they're writing genre fiction. That's not to say that a genre fiction can't be literary. Even if you're thinking of where the book is in the bookstore, you know, there is a chunk that's just like a general fiction area, which is often where literary fiction tends to live. But I guess, yeah, maybe I'm blinded by how I never go and look in that section, and I don't often read that section. Not often contemporary literary fiction books. I'll read like classics that are considered literary fiction. Yeah, so anyways, I think either I did not correctly explain the question, or this is a wake-up call for me. That's fair. Like, I learned something. It's very interesting. So if you voted on that question and you had a different understanding of what literary or genre fiction means, actually just let me know what you think literary fiction is. Yeah, I'd be really curious. Finally, we get to the question that started it all. Would you rather write a love triangle or never get to write any romantic arcs? And ultimately, as someone who writes romance, I had to choose it. I had to choose the love triangle. I'm not a big fan of them. I'd rather they not happen. In fact, they're one of my biggest pet peeves, but I think there is a way to evolve the idea of a love triangle potentially. That's the way I'm justifying it in my brain. But 55% of people said they'd rather have no romantic arcs ever. And I totally get that. I'm a fan of having undertones, even in contemporaries where like that's not ultimately the thing. We don't know if they get together at the end. Who cares? That wasn't the growth of the story, but I still like kind of having it there. And finally, I wanted to end on this random setting question. This is actually one of several that the boyfriend recommended, which is, would you rather have a constant rainstorm or a constant sandstorm? I thought this one would give the biggest divide, so I kind of wanted it as a point of reference. This question for me was actually harder to pick between than I initially thought when I heard it, because of the parameters when you think about when you're writing. Because if it's constantly raining, you have to think of the technology and how the world would have changed and evolved. You know, potentially if humans are your characters, what would humans do? Like, well, we would have to come up with, you know, not just umbrellas, it's constantly raining. What would you do there? Versus constant sandstorm. I'm actually writing Project Death, which is set in a more desert-y area that does have sandstorms. So I'm surprised that my initial inclination, and ultimately what I chose, was to deal with the constant rainstorm. I don't know if it's because I like the vibe of that better, a little bit more blues or greens. But I was correct in my initial assumption, which is that 89% of people chose constant rainstorm versus the 11% that chose constant sandstorm. Huge. The divide is huge. And you know what? Fascinating. You 11%. I would love to read your constant sandstorm story. Ooh, say that 5 times fast. Constant sandstorm story. Constant sandstorm stories. Constant sandstorm. Nope. But anyways, that is all 15 would you rather questions. I'd be really curious if you have any others that you would like to ask people. I think it would be fun to do this again, so please do comment that down below. Also let me know what you think or how you define what literary fiction is and where that divide is between literary and genre fiction. Curious. And please do include in your comment down below if you would like to advocate for any of the minority opinions. I would love to hear it. But now it is time to do our Authortuber shout out. And for this video, that is Devasia at Grape Fry. I love Devasia. I actually first met Devasia when she was in the chats for the live streams, and her humor is just like equal parts witty and dry and ridiculous, and it is so much fun. It really comes through in her videos and on live streams as well, and it just makes everything she's talking about it's just that much better. My favorite is just like, she doesn't always draw attention to it either. She just will say something in her vlogs and then move on, and I'm back here laughing, cracking up. I have to replay parts of it. She also recently passed 1,000 subscribers, which is incredible. That is such a milestone, and I'm so excited for her. She deserves them all and so many more. One of my favorite things that she's been doing recently, I say recently, like the past 6 months, her and the Troublemaker crew, is they very regularly host writing sprints together, and just the amount of chaos, the pure, unadulterated, unfiltered, wonderful, beautiful chaos that they managed to have all together while then still sprinting is truly incredible. My other favorite thing about Devasha's vlogs is how she really takes you into each part of what she's writing. Most recently, she's been on Act 2, finishing off Act 2 of her story. So anyways, I cannot recommend Devasha enough. She's incredible, and I will leave a link to her channel down below. But thank you guys so much for watching. Thanks to y'all who played along with me on Instagram. Is that how I should say that? And I will see y'all all very soon with a new video. Bye. So it's really interesting to see. Yes, that is what I said. The next would you rather question. 50-50. 50% of people would rather write, 50% of people would rather, what?